Okay, Henrik, good to see you. Um, there have been a bunch of announcements in the CGM space, and as you wrote a post about them, a Medium post,
Yeah.
and I think they're a pretty big deal. So I think why don't we go through them one by one and just talk about both your reactions to them. I have some thoughts as well. I just think that's probably the easiest way to tackle this.
Yeah, sounds good. And thanks for taking the time to have this conversation, Eric. I think it's always fun to jam with people around CGM and where it's at and where it's going. So excited to spend this next hour diving into it.
Great.
Yeah, so I think out of these big announcements, let's really start with Abbott, because they're the biggest company that are seemingly on the trajectory to kind of do the most innovation. So I want to bring up a few slides and we can kind of go through some of the things that have happened there. All right, so starting with their announcement of the third generation of Fretta Libre, which is called Fretta Libre 3. And it was announced in Europe, and we actually don't know how long it's going to take before it comes to the US. But I think what's interesting about this, there were kind of like three major announcements that they made in this version. First one is a size reduction, so 70% size reduction compared to the Fretta Libre 2. The Libre 2 is roughly the size of a quarter, a little bit larger. So 70% reduction is quite a bit. I think a part of that obviously is volume, but it's definitely going to be smaller. The other part is
it's roughly the size of 2 pennies, so it's minuscule.
Yeah, no, and wear experience is and how it looks on your arm or on your body is a big part of what people hesitate about when they sign up for Steady and want to try it out or buy one of these devices for the first time. So definitely a huge improvement. The other part is Bluetooth, right? I think the crutch of the Freestyle compared to some of these other manufacturers like the Dexcom or Medtronic has been the fact that you have to tap it and scan it manually every 8 hours. So now this comes with full Bluetooth capability. So it's now becoming, what's called like a true CGM compared to what it was before, which is called a flash CGM. And it's supposed to update data directly to your phone every minute, as opposed to, the gold standard today is 5 minutes. So improvement there on how much data we get as well. And then third, which I think is not unimportant, is that it's actually going to have the same price as the version that is out today. And that means, what are we going to see on the existing devices? Are we going to see price reduction there? And I think it also means something about how much of a cost increase is this to produce for them? Maybe not that big, right? So they're getting to significant scale on their supply chain and R&D and so on. That makes it possible to actually produce these devices at pretty low cost, even though they're improving on them consistently.
Yeah, I think the Bluetooth is enormous because it's really what separated, as you called out, it's what separated them from the Dexcom devices. And so if you're wearing this passively and looking for data to show up on your phone or your watch, this is now a contender for that. So you can, the usability of that, competitive usability of that really changes quite a bit. Plus, before this, it was all NFC, so it was limited to a pretty small subset of a smaller set of devices than or phones than this will be. So this is huge, and I also think creates a really interesting dynamic in the market for, as I said, the next layer of services. So even folks like Apple and Google, who have, I think, historically been more connected to the Dexcom devices just because of the Bluetooth, all of a sudden have another hardware option out there. So I think that's a really big deal.
Yeah, and the it means that the two biggest manufacturers and the two contenders that are kind of at the top of their game, I think, they're really going now neck on neck, right? Because it's like the delta between the two solutions is now, I mean, it's almost nothing, right?
Yeah.
Except for in one factor, which is price. So it's really going to be interesting to see, what happens with Dexcom and G7 when that comes out. And I think we're gonna come back to Dexcom after we kind of talk through this Abbott announcements. But I do think the comparison there is becoming more interesting for consumers, right? Because it kind of like there is going to be price pressure for sure.
Absolutely.
And then the second big thing that I think came out from Abbott, just kind of like a week or a few weeks, I forgot if it's like before or after Fretta Libre 3 announcement, is the Libre Sense, which is if you lift your head away from the diabetes market, which obviously the Fretta Libre is focused on, you start thinking about all of these other kind of applications where you can use blood sugar monitoring, athletes or, performance optimization and so on. They announced the Libre Sense, which is specifically non-clinical. It has, I think it is basically like the Fretta Libre 2 technology-wise, but with some amount of limitations so that they can fly under the radar when it comes to regulatory and insurance and other sort of complicating factors. It has limited range. I think it's been announced, or at least rumor, that it will have between 70 to 200 milligram range, which is, for someone that isn't suffering from any issues when it comes to blood sugar control, like that should be well within the range that you should be, 100% of the time. And yeah, as I said, like hopefully they can sell it over the counter. I don't, again, this is Europe, again, because they have more, I think, just more stringent regulatory framework and it's faster kind of approving these devices. But it will come to the US, which will be the first CGM that is actually approved for use for non-diabetics, which is, it's going to be that's a landmark milestone that we've hit when it comes to rolling out this technology to a broader set of people.
Yeah, I've had plenty of people talk to me about using CGM for primarily for diet purposes, or trying to understand how their metabolism was working. And the number one issue is just access to a device. The fact that in the United States, you have to go through a physician and get a prescription is real friction. So that going away is a really big deal. So if pioneering this in Europe, where over-the-counter CGM is already accepted, also I think in Asia and Latin America too, you can simply walk into a pharmacy and pick up a CGM without having to have a prescription. I think this at least begins is a path to doing the same here in the United States. So that's great. And in between now and then, I think what's fascinating is these other consumer services, which we'll cover in a second, which effectively do the same thing, make it easier for somebody without diabetes to get a CGM. So access, this is a huge shift. And as you said, this allows them to potentially come to the US market, satisfy regulators. Hey, we've constrained this thing from 70 to 200, and we've segmented the product line so we can, so this is not going to get used by people with diabetes. There's less risk of that. This is a non-medical device, as I think they even say on the package. I think that's great. I think that's a huge shift for the market. So
yeah. And I think what they announced too was that this will come with a developer platform, which is interesting because Abbott traditionally has been very strict and kind of closed in terms of data sharing. what's interesting about Dexcom, and I think one of the reasons why they've performed so well in the markets, not only because of their device, but also their openness around sharing data and letting people build applications on top of it. It powers these loop systems or automated insulin delivery systems for people who are on insulin pumps, and a wide range of apps out there that are targeted towards people with diabetes. But obviously, again, we're coming back to the consumer service, but I think all of them are based on accessing data in a more real-time fashion. So if there's like a platform play here that Abbott is trying to do, which is exclusively for people with non-diabetes, I think that is like a very exciting play.
Yeah, we talked about once the fact that the minute you have a segment of customers and you have a device that is not wrestling with diabetes, and this is that changes the risk profile too, potentially, of giving access to the data and have people using services on top of it. Because if this is for people with diabetes, then you're a very different risk profile in terms of the quality of the data getting across, whether the services are certified in some way, because people are making much more serious decisions based on them, or much more acute decisions, whether or not to bolus insulin or something like that. Whereas if you've carved off this market, or this device to a different market, I think that there's should be a whole different threshold for data use. So, as you pointed out, Dexcom has found a way to do this pretty well already.
Yeah, and I think it sort of further, validates the one of the kind of core hypotheses that I have around CGM, which is this analogy around GPS and maps, right? That like the device itself and the data it generates, it's very similar to what we saw with the development of the GPS. And then you start thinking about the kind of applications that are on top of the GPS and the data that it generates. And those applications, I mean, think about, Google Maps and, Apple Maps and, Foursquare, like all of these kind of apps that are built around the data that comes to the GPS. And I think we can think about CGM in a very similar way. You need an applications layer to tell you, where are you coming from, where are you, and where are you going? And really then do you get to this really deep layer of value based on, the glucose data that exists, in our bodies.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that whole layer of services, you talk about Google Maps and Foursquare, but there's also Lyft and Uber and a whole layer of transportation services that showed up in the next generation, which are hard to imagine right now. But yeah, I think those will come too on top of CGM.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's talk about Dexcom a little bit, because they are obviously, I think like in terms of, functionality available today, for people living with diabetes, they are really, the top player. Most features, really solid platform data access, and also very high accuracy. Actually, better accuracy than the Libre 2. I think that is changing. I think Abbott is improving their technology, but I think Dexcom is definitely like today on the market a more fully fledged product. And obviously they've announced that next year, it was actually going to come out, I think Q4. So it was going to come out now, but because of COVID, it's been slightly delayed. But they've been working together with Verily to develop Generation 7, which is going to be much smaller, same capabilities in terms of Bluetooth and data platform and all of those things. It's still going to be 10-day wear. So like, that's actually, it's pretty big difference between Abbott's 14 days. Like the difference between 14 and 10 days is big, I think.
Well,
I think
it's 3 devices a month versus 2. So
yeah.
And with the cost difference, that's pretty different.
Yeah, and then as you say, cost, right? Like, that is the biggest thing. I think it's a little bit harder to calculate the cost between Dexcom and Abbott today because the Libre is completely disposable. The Dexcom has two parts to it, a transmitter and the actual sensor, and the transmitter is good for about 3 months. But I think I've done the math a bunch of times, and I think, you know, just compared, monthly cost for a Dexcom is on the order of $500 versus the Freestyle Libre, which is about 75. So it's a big difference today.
Yeah, and I think what will be interesting both on the pricing pressure side, but also on the segmentation side is I think the minute you have these other markets open up, like the general consumer market for CGM, you also have segmentations on precision, right? You know, there are accuracy, as you called out, which is the accuracy can be, you can have lower accuracy with a device that's for general consumers versus people with diabetes. So that'll be interesting too. Not that you should, but Dexcom can continue to sort of point to the higher accuracy and precision, and for some people that's going to be worth doing. But the price differential, differential between the two will be harder to maintain over time. Just because I think you could have a 2x difference, but I think it's pretty hard to maintain like a 5x difference.
So what I've heard is that the thing that actually sets them apart price-wise is the COGS, and the COGS as a result of the accuracy. Yeah. So the production line, or the method of production that Dexcom has, you know, is much harder to actually, you know, get to the price point that Freestyle has. Yeah.
Well, I think also coming, just to call out, I think also came with the G6, and it'll probably come with the G7, is that we'll get to a device that's a little bit less intimidating to apply than, say, the G5 was. So I think one of the advantages that the Libre had and has had consistently is you basically put this thing on your arm. There's a quick little pop, you know, and a little pinprick, but it's really mild, and the application is sort of invisible. You're not really looking at the, you know, it feels pretty unintimidating. Whereas at least in the G5, when you had to put it on your abdomen, with the applicator looked a lot more like a needle and or syringe, and I think with the G7 those kinds of things are also going down. And I have to say, other than access being the highest friction thing for these devices, the next thing down was sort of intimidation factor, which is how as intimidating it is to put something that, you know, actually penetrates your skin, which is a barrier for some people in terms of like, would I do this or not do this? And then I think the third thing that you indicated before is how obvious is it visually? And those things, obviously, as these things get smaller and smaller to the size of pennies, they're hard to see. And I think we'll talk about it in a second with Levels, one of the consumer companies. They've actually developed or made a nice little patch that you put over the actual CGM, which makes it look cool, like as if it, you know, something you actually would want to show off. So it's like a black patch with 2 or 3 white stripes on it, and it's almost a badge of honor that you're wearing one.
Yeah, I think this wear experience, like just a trajectory there in the last few years, has been so. I know you talked about before about the G5, Dexcom G5, right? Which was like, it was basically like a gun with a needle in there, and you had to stick it on your stomach. Yeah, and it was like, you know, you were doing it, you got sweaty. I got sweaty palms, you know. And look at, you know, obviously Abbott leading the charge there with the Libre applicator, but even Dexcom G6 has this cute little, you know, almost Star Wars looking applicator with a button, and you just, you know, and you're done. So it's like been kind of cutified, which I think is easy to laugh away and be like, oh, that's not important, but actually makes a huge difference.
Now, you know, listen, there's enough of the population which is uncomfortable with that if you make them more comfortable or make it more entertaining, removes a huge barrier to trying this stuff. Why don't we dive into the consumer services?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, so when I wrote the post, I sort of, because I've been seeing them pop up, continuously over the past few months, and it was interesting to kind of just list them out. And actually, since we spoke, since I posted the post, actually, there's a new one just got announced, Januaryai, and they all look the same. They all look similar. I mean, look at the two examples we have on the screen, right? Levels and Super Sapiens. I mean, it's almost like it's 2 pages from the same website. But I think Levels for sure has captured a lot of the kind of, Silicon Valley tech ecosystem. And essentially what they do is just focused on what they say, like healthy people generally, ship them 2 devices a month, with a much more kind of interesting or well-developed applications layer that helps people identify, where are they in their metabolic journey? How are they reacting to things like food, exercise, medication? Maybe not so much medication, but more so diet and exercise. People do all sorts of cool things with these services already, like do challenges and weight loss challenges and those type of things. It's been really interesting to see. And then Super Sapiens, which is, the target audience is slightly different. I think they're focused very much on performance and athletes. Started by Phil Sutherland, who is a pro cycler for the Novo Nordisk cycling team, who hilariously enough is type 1, but have a long-standing relationship with Abbott through Novo Nordisk, and actually developed a partnership with them, and I think was sort of co-developing the sport biosensor that we just looked at. And they are the first applications layer that I think is built on this new developer platform that Abbott is launching.
Yeah, well, this to me is just this is the future of this market, because the CGMs are one thing, but that the interpretation layer on top of that is just is actually the next most interesting problem. I think first, as we talked about before, for a lot of people, just getting access to a CGM has been hard enough, and these companies provide that because they use an internal physician or an associated physician to give the prescription. That removes the barrier of access, which, like I said, is primary. And then the second thing, which is how do I interpret this data? What does this mean? And they've done, from what I can see, I know I've seen Levels a little bit more, but it tells you what this means. And for somebody that doesn't have diabetes, that hasn't been watching this, and there aren't a dozen books or a dozen endocrinologists you can go see to interpret this data, the application layer is hugely important, because it contains sort of a thesis about what to pay attention to, what's good and bad. And while these things are still pretty early, it's critical to know to get that guidance. So I think that's that. I think the next layer on top of it will be interpreting even that, which is if you want one interpretation for performance, like Super Sapiens, which is your goal is to bike harder and fuel appropriately to be in a race and perform faster, that'll be one path. And then I think there will be a whole nother set of services, which, and probably companies quite differently, that are focused entirely on diet, just because that's a very big market. It's a very different customer type. And, we'll see whether that's where Levels ends up going, or if it's more in the general fitness category. But CGM will have different companies focusing on diet and versus focusing on athletic performance.
Yeah, I think this kind of segmentation that we're seeing is super interesting. I think we're just scratching the surface of it, but we're actually seeing the segmentation happen in real time, kind of like, you see an emergence of a market, and then different players trying out different segments of that market. And I can tell you, for people that sign up for Steady today, coming with a wide variety of levels of context on how to use CGM and how it works, and how do you best use it. So I think this, like, the massive value that these applications layers provide today is really guidance on how do I extract the most amount of value out of the CGM, which is interesting because it's a very similar challenge to you have if you're living with diabetes. Most people don't know how to extract the maximum amount of value out of the device, and that is a problem that can be entirely solved with software, which makes it like hyper interesting.
Well, that I feel like that's what you guys have focused on at Steady, both at the software layer and the support layer, is to really help people use this, manage their lives on top of this data, which is, what do I pay attention to? What do I not pay attention to? What's actually getting better? How do I make progress? And what is the support I need to go to actually do that? And I think that's the layer, to me, which most people really want. And whether they, in the diet community, when they go sign up for Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig or any of these things, they're looking like, how do I get the support to actually go through this process? And that will happen, that'll happen at the software layer or the application layer. But I also think it's really interesting to talk about, you pointed out in the context of diabetes, a lot of this, if you go online, you'll find on social networks and elsewhere online, communities that have formed that help people in the diabetes community manage and interpret their experience. So, well, I ate this and I had this response, or how do I, this doesn't make sense to me. And whether it's, groups like Diatribe, or other things, that layer has been invaluable. And it's sort of starting to see the exact same thing. If you go follow Levels on Instagram, you will start to see them post and repost people's screenshots of their CGM experience. So I ate this and my blood spiked like that. So this is what a bowl of oatmeal did, or a bowl of rice did, and tomorrow I'm going to try it, but I'm going to try to add something to it and see what it, see the response. That community, I think, will be as valuable as it has been to the community of people with diabetes. It will be as important here too. So there's this community layer, there's a services layer, maybe combined with software or application, that is going to be enormous. And one of these folks is going to end up being the Peloton of CGM. It's going to be something that goes far beyond, a spinning bike in your house, but it's a spinning bike, it's classes and support by great instructors. It'll be the community of other people that you're riding with, even if it's, only one other person that a leaderboard. But that combination of things will make people be like, you know what, I can sign up for this, and I'm not getting a bike. I'm getting a successful exercise experience, right? I'm going to be on, this is going to be motivational for me to get on and commit to this multiple times a week. And likewise, I'm not just getting a device on my shoulder, I'm getting a device, some guidance, and a community that motivates me to get better. And those layers, to me, are what is emergent right now, and still incredibly early. Right. And this, like I said, this will segment very differently for people that are struggling with weight loss than people that are aspiring to bicycle road races. So I would be very surprised not to see very distinct companies. There are new companies emerging. I would also, as we've talked about a little bit, I can think of at least a half a dozen categories of companies that will have to have a CGM strategy in the next couple of years, because I don't think that you can be Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig or NutriSense or any of these, not NutriSense, I'm trying to think of the other one, but that you can't be these companies and not have some CGM program. So that we're on the cusp of something quite large.
Yeah, I think that's like the more I think about just like the comparison to Peloton, I think there's so much of that rings true. There's like one major difference, right? Which is like to get access to Peloton, you get to pay, I don't know, what is it, like $5,000 for an exercise bike.
Yeah,
you put in your, yeah. It's, but here, already today, you can buy this sensors for $75 for a whole month. And not only that, but it actually, gives you access, it gives you data passively. Mm-hmm. So like, it's actually $75 to generate a month of data. So if you think about it like that, like that's a lot of data, and a lot of opportunity for you to create these kind of experiments that you can post on social media, but like the goal of that is obviously to compare yourself with other people, to understand more about yourself, but also to kind of further the kind of science and understanding of metabolic health and diabetes and like all of the other things that kind of happens with our bodies over time when we eat certain things or exercise in a certain way. So the kind of impact of that, you compare, the low price, relatively low price, like if you think about it, plus the amount of data, you kind of get back to that thing that you just mentioned, which is like, wow, like there's a lot of companies that are going to be impacted by this shift that we're seeing.
Well, I think that's actually that's a terrific lens to look through this, which is what do you get for 1 month, right? And so you can imagine paying $75. So at a $75 cost, you put this on for a month, and then you go to your annual physical. And the diagnostic quality data that your physician has is in some ways better than what they can get from blood labs, particularly if you do this once a year for 10 years. You will see your metabolic response to foods and how it's either fine or it's degrading over time, right? And we have a population, just very simple metrics. You've got roughly 1 million people that are type 1 diabetics, about 1.5 million. You have roughly 30 million people that are type 2 that have type 2 diabetes. These are all US numbers. You have 30 million people, which is, again, somewhere between 15 or 30 times the size of that. And then 20 or 30 times the size of that. And then you have 100 million people, or roughly a third of the population, that is in the category of pre-diabetes. So all of those people, and particularly for that largest group, that 100 million people who, or at least they're currently on the road to having a pretty high probability of ending up with diabetes, you all of a sudden can see where they are, how far along they are, and stop that much earlier. Let alone all the people. I mean, of those people that have pre-diabetes, many of them are just completely unaware of it because it's just associated with so many other conditions. But all that said and done, I can absolutely see this being sent to you once a year, a month before you walk into your physical. It's again the cost of blood labs. I mean, it's in the same magnitude, and all of a sudden your doctor's like, okay, we have something to talk about. It's such higher resolution than something like A1C or a fasting glucose number in terms of diabetes risk. And so I imagine it as a diagnostic tool. And again, whether you're Anthem or Kaiser or Stanford Health Systems, it would be very surprising to me that there is not a program in place in the next couple of years. And if you are somebody like Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic and you have these sort of very high-end diagnostic experiences, I would be surprised, targeted towards executives or things like that. I can't believe this won't be core to that platform within 3 years at most.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that I am currently obsessed with diagnostics because I think we do a very poor job today to understand, are you at risk for diabetes, and how do you communicate where on the risk scale you are, like where on the journey towards a full diagnosis are you? As you mentioned, about half of the people living with prediabetes doesn't even know about it. They just don't know. And the numbers, they might actually not even show up in their labs. They might come in, have good fasting blood glucose numbers, and they might have somewhat elevated A1C, but since their fasting is good, people are kind of like, oh, doctor might be just, nothing to worry about here, even though, their response to stress or poor sleep or high carbohydrate foods is just off the charts.
Yeah.
And, putting in some fairly simple, at least in my mind, preventative measures at that point might just prevent a diagnosis altogether if you do it in at the right time, and that is just, I think maybe might be the solution to the diabetes epidemic that we have around the world.
Yeah. No, I mean, A1C, which is the default measure probably for most doctors right now in terms of risk profile, is unfortunately is just an average over over months of that number, and an average can be incredibly deceptive is one problem. So you could be having very severe spikes and troughs, and that's masked in an average. But also, I think, most people that treat diabetes closely and watch the progress in a person from prediabetes to diabetes will tell you there are enough cases where a person the year before in their previous exam did not have diabetes, and maybe even wasn't even over the line of being in prediabetes, and the following year they did. The system capitulates at some point, and we unfortunately don't have a ton of data on why that happens and when that happens. But there's no question in my mind that the minute you have granular data and you are watching these cycles on an hourly and daily basis, or even the data across that predicting the move from from somebody without diabetes to prediabetes, or prediabetes to full diabetes, will be much, much easier and will happen much more consistently. And so the idea of being able to diagnose that risk early enough and intervene, just a completely different, we'll have a completely different view into that. So again, we're talking about a third of the US population, 100 million people. It is enormous. And yeah, and just, we don't have to, the rest of the world is not in a different boat. You have 10% of the population in countries like India and China who are going to be very motivated, given the fact that healthcare is much more centralized, to find solutions to that. You have not dissimilar numbers in other Asian and European countries, and then in some countries you have much higher numbers, in the Middle East, et cetera, for type 2 certainly. So this is an absolutely global problem. U.S. Is not alone in this both risk and opportunity.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, I just thinking about it more, I wouldn't be surprised if your, insurance company will just pay you to actually wear one of these devices for, 2 weeks out of every year.
Yep.
It'll just be like a part of your regular, oh, have you gotten your labs? It will just show up in the mail, and you'll just put it on, and it will be, connected to their system, and then you'll be flagged automatically, if something is wrong, and then they will, put you through like a specific care plan or something like that to try and to try and kind of limit the cost they will incur over time should the kind of disease progress.
Let's go on to the talk quickly about folks like Apple and Google. We can move a couple of slides, and yeah, I mean, so just historically, there's been a few things here. So both Apple and Google, they've recently gone through the process, or going through the process of acquiring Fitbit, have had sort of access to some diabetes data on the watch, certainly on the phones. And that's, I think these are the other interesting set of people that you're gonna feel some real innovation from in the next, certainly in the next 6 to 12 months as these devices come up. I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think some of these, like, health monitoring, consumer devices and apps that have been around for, probably decades at this, or decade at least at this point, right? Like they've been important for sure, but I do think like the level of insight, is being shifted completely with this new type of sensor that I think does, passively collects data, but at a level of specificity and real timeness that is not something that we have seen before. So, I mean, Apple's been rumored for a long time working on a CGM. There were some like paparazzi photo taken of, not of Steve, but of Tim Cook, I think, like wearing a Fretta Libre at some point. And, Google has been working with Dexcom through Verily. So, I think for sure they want to play in this market. We haven't seen them make any acquisitions or, more strategic partnerships at like a product level yet. So it's going to be interesting to watch, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see some announcements happening in the next 12 to 24 months, because again, like if the Google Fitbit acquisition kind of goes through, I just can't see it. Like the data set is too valuable, and the application layer is like it's so greenfield, right? Like, so I think they definitely want to play, and I think they all recognize that health is such a big part of their kind of device strategy at this point. Yeah,
that your language is right there. I mean, to date, all of these devices have mostly been about paying attention to movement. We started with helmet counting steps, and then we were able, through some of these sensors, to add something like to add heart rate. And now we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated, and we can, we can measure things like, I mean, some of the newer watches can predict arrhythmias, and we have HRV, or heart rate variability, as a monitor. And again, as we have more and more data, we can actually correlate that to stress and sleep behavior and the rest of it. But even those things are just at such a lower level of diagnostic value than continuous glucose monitoring. I mean, that we're talking about a completely different value in terms of diagnostic insight. So this will move all of these devices, when paired with a CGM, into a health diagnostic category that is certainly on par with blood labs, right? Yeah. And the ability for you to over the counter go spend, $75 for a full month, or even less than that for 2 weeks, and actually perform a self-diagnosis with some services on top, with some of these other consumer services on top, is just going to shift consumer health to a completely different space. And that, though, I just think it'll actually bring health back to the first person, right? You will all of a sudden have a different insight and a different level of potential responsibility for yourself, because it's not squirreled away in a lab at Quest or LabCorp or in a doctor's office miles away. It's actually something you can pick up at CVS or Walgreens or get through the mail from Levels. And all of a sudden you can actually know where you are. And I just think that will actually shift this sense of I have to actually go ask somebody else to know if I'm healthy or not, to I can actually own that. I actually should own that responsibility a little bit more. And that to me is profound.
Yeah, this notion of first person health, I think that has the chance to be incredibly powerful as it shifts the power from the physicians more to the person. And I think it's incredible exciting. I also like that term that, I don't know if you coined it or not, but the kind of the depth of diagnostic insight, or the depth of diagnostic value, being so different in these in the CGM devices compared to all other kind of health tracking that we've had. I think it's a good proxy of overall value that comes from this data set compared to a lot of the other kind of movement tracking sensors we've seen on the market to date.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have two things to say. One is this whole category I would just start to talk about as CGM health. There is an entire set of businesses that are going to have to be in the CGM health business. And whether it's hospitals, doctors, dietitians, nutritionists, even people, the sort of popular doctors out there that, Dr. Mark Hyman, that talk about diet, Dina Ornish, et cetera, are going to have to enter the CGM health space. It's not something you'll be able to not have an opinion on or not have a program that engages, within a matter of years. So that category is the emergent category. And I guess the other thing I'd ask you quickly in the context of something like Steady Health, do you see this shift as people get CGMs, this shift towards more of a first person orientation towards their health and their and diabetes as they get CGMs, as they get support?
Yeah, I mean, we see that, absolutely. I think in diabetes specifically, we've been treating everybody in like this one size fits all care model, right? Oh, you have a diabetes diagnosis. Great. Okay, we're going to sign you up for a quarterly visit with your doctor for the rest of your life, right? Regardless of, how you're doing, what you're struggling with, and so on. And I think we're just through this, level of insight and data and personalization. We can just go to a much more, custom model for every single individual that is tailored to what are their needs at this very moment. So that we can focus on, spend more time on the people that are really struggling with something. Maybe they just had their first child, maybe they just moved, they just, lost their job, those kind of things that actually do impact, what kind of food do you have access to, what kind of exercise do you have access to, like all the things that play a big role into our lifestyles. And then for the people who are, kind of doing well and following their strategy, I mean, we don't have to spend any time with them, beyond, being there when they have any specific questions. And I think that is like, we let them be in control of like, when do they need help and how do they need it? But making sure that, like we're there when that happens. But then like really be kind of, both reactive, but also be proactive. Because remember, like we can actually see what happens, to their outcomes on a weekly basis. So we can just respond. So typically, like they don't reach out to us, but we actually reach out to them and say, hey, Jessica, we've seen that your numbers have been not as good as we want them to be for the past 2 weeks. What's been going on with you? And that kind of opens the door to actually taking care of some of that or helping out with some of the things that that this person is struggling with.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of, you can imagine the analogous set of conversations in a case with somebody that's that's trying to manage, a diet or weight loss problem, it can't even really happen right now, right? But you can imagine there's an analogous conversation when somebody's, somebody remotely, whether it's a physician or a dietitian, has access to you've given them access to your CGM data, and they can be in that monitoring and support role. So that to me is just like, again, sort of hard to imagine right now, and almost shows up automatically the minute this whole consumer CGM space starts to open up. And I will say the market does segment. I mean, the experience from people I've talked to segments exactly how you just described it. There are some people that if you put on a CGM and they see the data, their behavior changes automatically, which is, you're like, oh my God, that's what white rice does to me, or oatmeal does to me. I will never eat that again. I cannot unsee the spike that created. I'm not going to. So, and then there's a group of people that, I would say that's actually a small percentage of the population that just sees the information, and that's the transformational moment. And there's other segments of people that need various levels of support, engagement, troubleshooting, et cetera, to be strategizing, which is, I know the facts now, I see the data, but now what's the behavior that, do you have guidance as to how I should go change behavior?
Yeah, no, and I think that is just such a important piece, and the real timeness in and the place that it has in reinforcing behavior or building behavior change over time. That again, like with weight and even with steps and all of these things, just the learning loop is just too long. Like the feedback loop is not immediate enough for actually to take, oh, I've been gaining weight the last 4 weeks. Let me think back about what I've done in the last, month, to try and like triangulate, like, oh, it's probably, oh, I went out for beers. Done. Like, you can't, nobody's going to do that amount of like, retrospective on their own life and like, all the notes and everything. It just doesn't work. We're too lazy for that, I think, in general. So this is just, completely novel, I think, in terms of like being able to change behavior.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the only thing like that to me that, some people debate on the timing of when all these shifts will happen. Not the device part, but when people will be aware of this. And I think one of the things we've talked about in the past is just how quickly this is already changing, even with a handful of services and options on the market. Just the ability to watch people already posting CGM data. Now, this was not new in the diabetes community, but it is new in the consumer space. And, if you go follow, levels on Instagram, you can already see people posting CGM data. And I think that will change things dramatically, because as they go market and reach out to various influencers on, places like Instagram and other social media, they will go work with some of those folks, and those people will post their journey, and that will educate hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of people who haven't even signed up for this. So that shift is going to happen faster than we think about, than even the population that's actually using this services. I mean, it's very similar to the way keto exploded over the last couple of years, which was, it was very niche and very specific. And then all of a sudden you saw relatively high profile influencers on these networks start to do it, see dramatic results, make claims about it, et cetera. And, it's now, a common term and a known, people, if you ask them what it is, people could describe the diet to you, and it was not on anybody's radar in any meaningful way 5 years ago. So I expect that shift. I also expect in the next couple of years, just as we talked about before, Al Roker goes and gets bariatric surgery, the Today Show weatherman, and that completely changed by 8x the number, a decade later, the number of surgeries that are being done, just because people are aware of it as an option. Likewise, I think you'll see the same too. You'll see some public figure either have a major weight loss event, and they too will be effectively, they'll change the awareness level of CGM health pretty much across the board. And some of it's either come directly from these companies, but some of it may just come from these people signing up on their own.
Yeah, who's going to be Al Roker of CGM, right?
It'll happen soon. I don't
Yeah.
know who, but it'll happen soon. Listen, this has been great. I hope it's been useful for you, and we should do this again as more stuff comes out.
Yeah, this has been super fun. Thank you for the time, Eric.
Okay, take care, Henrik.